Good evening and welcome. It's so nice to have you all with us. My name is Colleen Douglas. Last time I didn't introduce myself and I was told I should have, so I'm Colleen Douglas. And I've been a part of the team that have conceived of and brings this series of workshops to you. As we all know by now, we've just gone through a highly contentious election cycle with each side pushing in its own agenda, a process sometimes known as spin. So tonight we'll take a closer look at the playbook of political spin. We're going to hear from our two local veteran reporters from the Christian Science Monitor, who have brought together a bevy of experts and some video clips to make sense of it all. Daniel B. Wood and Gloria Goodale comprise the California Bureau of the Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper, the Christian Science Monitor. Dan as bureau chief and Gloria as a reporter. Each of them has a rich background of reporting on various topics for the Monitor. Together, they make a dynamite team, offering insights rooted in a deep historical perspective. Over to you, Dan and Glo.
Thank you, Julie.
Wow. Thanks for coming. Again, how many people had reservations? How many people had huge reservations? I think we have another very strong evening for you with lots of clips that are both entertaining and educational as well.
Okay, and so here is our roadmap. Our roadmap for the evening is, first we will have a little bit about spin, what is it, who says, and a little bit of perspective and history. Then we will move over to hearing from two of our Monitor correspondents in the Washington Bureau who write under the banner of the Washington Decoder. So they will decode a bit of the election cycle spin for you. And then we will round the evening out with a workshop where we will do a little bit of spin sniffing ourselves.
So who wants to tell us what they think spin is? You, sir. Yeah, what is spin?
It is a series of different ideas.
You know what, we're all in luck because I looked up spin doctor on the internet. That's the final arbiter of everything this day and age. And here's what it says. Spin doctor, a person such as a political aide whose job involves trying to control the way something such as an important event is described to the public in order to influence what people think about it. So here's a trick question. How many people here are not spin doctors? You're lying. But just in case the internet isn't the final arbiter, we went and asked some experts. So I'm going to introduce who these people are. Steve Shears, professor of political science at Carleton College of Minnesota, and the author of about a dozen books on political science. Sherry Jeffy is here at USC and appears on local TV all the time, obviously here on election night. David Greenberg, the third guy on here, is professor of journalism, history, and media studies at Rutgers, and has just completed a book on the history of spin.
Well, spin, I think, is a set of statements that are empirically dubious. You know, there are factual problems with them, but they serve the goals of the spinner. And so it's really important for people, when confronted with spin, to subject it to a very serious truth test.
Spin is what anybody will get away with in terms of discussing something, as long as the voters let them get away with it. There is no way to get a handle on spin because almost everything that comes out of almost anybody's mouth involved in politics, including the media, is spin. In terms of the media spins because in a way that will bring them more eyeballs, as we say in television, or more readers. For example, a very good piece by the comic Andy Borowitz about the CNN coverage of Ebola began with the announcement that CNN has changed its banner slogan to, "Oh my God, we're all gonna die."
Spin implies a bit of a game, that there's some play involved, that we're getting spun, that there's counter spin, and it suggests, I think, something that's accurate too, which is the audience has some awareness of this. But increasingly, I think we have the tools to try to resist this, challenge it.
I think spin is everywhere. I think you're spinning your children. I think you're spinning your spouse. I think we all tend to use facts and arguments selectively to pursue our own ends. I think we're more aware of it in public life because there's so much attention to it. And unfortunately, a lot of journalists get sucked into the spin because there's so much of it, and your critical faculties aren't always at high alert 24/7.
Some suggest that while politicians have always spun to a certain degree, the rise of 20th century mass media has accelerated it. So now I'm going to tell you about this guy, Edward Bernays. He had been working with the Woodrow Wilson administration's Office of Public Information during World War I, trying to promote the idea that entering the war was trying to make the world safe for democracy. When the war was over, he wanted to see how the same campaign model could be used to push the same idea during peacetime. He felt like the word propaganda had been given a bad name by the Germans in World War I, so he came up with a much more benign and slippery word, public relations. Before I go any further, I want to make sure you know we're pointing to him not because he was necessarily a great, brilliant, or good man, that he was a turning point figure. But he did really change the idea of how people thought about lots of things. So as I read this quote, remember this is not about how right or true or good he was. He thought that human beings were highly susceptible to the herd instinct and what he called group mind, something that many of you here might disagree with. His own daughter thought that her dad's worldview meant that man needed an intercessory figure to help him understand the world, which she didn't necessarily agree with. She called it enlightened despotism. Anyway, here's the quote. I'm going to read it very slowly because it's a mouthful. It's from a book he wrote called Propaganda. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes are formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we've never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. That's the end of the quote. So very sneaky people, and some of them are sitting in this audience. I wrote a magazine story about Bernays back in 1982. He lived to be 103 years old. So here's what you need to know about Bernays. He's formally acknowledged as the founder of modern public relations. In 1923, he wrote the first book on the subject, Crystallizing Public Opinion, and he taught the first public relations course in America at New York University. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and became the personal agent of figures from Caruso to Samuel Goldwyn. He became an advisor for several presidents, from Coolidge to Eisenhower. Life magazine called him one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century. He had a long list of big-name clients, from General Electric to the American Tobacco Company. He was the first to use psychology and lots of background research in trying to get large numbers of people to think and behave differently. So I'm going to tell you about 4 campaigns he worked on to give you an idea of what he was about. Women and cigarettes. Bernays helped the smoking industry overcome one of the biggest social taboos of the time, women smoking in public. Women were only allowed to smoke in designated areas or not at all. Anyone caught violating the rule was arrested. Bernays came up with a great idea of staging the 1929 Easter Parade in New York City by hiring sexy models to hold lit Lucky Strike cigarettes, calling them torches of freedom. That got the foot in the door for women, and the rest is history. Some of you might remember Virginia Slims coming along several decades later. Bacon and eggs. He conducted a survey of physicians and reported their recommendation that people eat heavy breakfasts. He sent the results of the survey to 5,000 physicians, along with publicity touting bacon and eggs as the answer. Procter & Gamble. He found out that many kids hated Procter & Gamble when they grew up because their mothers had washed their faces so that the soap stung their eyes. Some of his research turned up the possibility of soap as sculpture. So he engineered a national contest that helped 22 million young people overcome resistance to soap and the company name. United Way, the charity. They came to him wanting to know why donations weren't going so well. So he asked people why they did and didn't give. He found out that donors resisted giving at the office and allowing their company to take credit for their donations. So he advised United Way to begin collecting at home, and its income soared. I wish we could have a whole evening on Edward Bernays. I was going through it just before this talk. He was the guy that said on those posters, maybe some of you remember these, 20,000 doctors recommend Lucky Strike tobacco because it irritates your throat less. That was Bernays. Now we're going to go back to Greenberg for follow-up on just a little bit more about it.
It's really with the 20th century, I think, with Theodore Roosevelt, the rise of mass media, and the orientation of the presidency toward public opinion in a kind of regular way that I think sort of changes the nature of what presidents do. You also have in this period public relations professionals, people like Edward Bernays and Bruce Barton, and people from advertising start getting involved in presidential campaigns, and eventually too in advising sitting presidents beyond just the campaign.
So this brings us back to something we have to remember, which is that America has changed, and so has media and culture, and what people expect and want from media. Some of you might remember the recent PBS series on the Roosevelts. What really stuck out to us about how times have changed dramatically are these comments.
His press secretary, Steve Early, turned away all reporters' questions about the president's disability. It's not a story, he'd say. When guests filed into the formal dining room at the White House, they found the president already seated at the head of the table. No one was to see him being wheeled down the hall. The Secret Service became expert at installing and removing special ramps to allow the president to enter a building without anyone seeing him being carried. And when the White House imposed rules on how he could be filmed and photographed, few complained.
It still amazes me to realize that even though the public knew that he had had polio, they had no idea, really most people, that he could not walk on his own power.
But the thing that's different from our time is that the press cooperated. And people bought it in the 30s and 40s. They bought it. They thought it was intrusive on the whole. I don't think anyone as afflicted as he was could ever be elected to national office today. I think it would be impossible, which is sad.
Did you hear him say the press cooperated? That people bought it in the 30s and 40s? How many people think the press would cooperate today like that? So crafting the message was the thing. And now we want to say that the media's role in doing that has also evolved. Or Sherry Jeffy said.
One analyst once divided the periods of the role of the media into three. Up until and through JFK, the media were lapdogs. As Vietnam and Watergate inserted themselves into the culture, the media acted like attack dog. With Gary Hart and Monkey Business and his dalliance with Donna Rice and what the media did then, and the fact that at that point in time, the tabloids were beginning to drive the media agenda. The media has been called a junkyard dog. I think that tells it all. That's how the role of the media, as I see it, has evolved, or you could argue devolved, in terms of reporting politics, in terms of engaging with spin, in terms of not allowing politicians to wriggle out of uncomfortable situations, uncomfortable discussions.
Uncomfortable situations. How many people here have ever seen a politician in an uncomfortable situation? Well, we put together a short collage to remind you of some of the biggies, as well as politicians simply trying to craft a message.
Well, I'm not a crook.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
I remember landing under sniper fire. There was supposed to be some kind of a greeting ceremony at the airport, but instead we just ran with our heads down to get into the vehicles to get to our base.
Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths, spent enormous sums, taken great risks to build and keep weapons of mass destruction.
I know for a fact that my account was hacked.
Is it spin when Hillary Clinton comes out and says, we landed under sniper fire, and we found out later that it's not so at all?
Well, you know, that's bad spin because it can be very quickly empirically disproved. You know, the best spin occupies the gray area where there are competing interpretations of fact. And when you can spin a gray area like that, you're more likely to get away with your interpretation. Hillary got caught with a black and white fact that didn't work for her.
So what is the line over which spin goes to become just literally a flat lie? Like, for instance, Bill Clinton saying, I did not have sex with that woman.
Well, yeah, that is more artful than Hillary's. Hillary's was fire, hostile fire when we could disprove that with evidence. I didn't have sexual relations with that woman is spin because it diffuses a depiction of what actually happened. What is sexual relations? How do you define it? How should we define it? It moves the question of true or false into a gray area. And that's a classic example of spin, and Bill Clinton was always very good at it.
So I guess the message here is that spin can be negative, but can also be other things, like,
Well, spin can also be a way to frame a message and turn it into something good, to redefine a situation, like It's Morning in America with Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign. Or it can be used to encourage a nation.
Oh yeah, well, spin can be constructive. It can be very good for a country. It can help a country develop a sense of positive resolve and so forth.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates and inflation down, more people are buying new homes, and our new families can have confidence in the future. America today is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Now that was spin because it's not true. It's a gross oversimplification of the wide number of difficulties America was facing in the depths of the Great Depression. So while it was empirically distorted, it had a very salutary effect. It helped to increase national morale in the midst of one of the worst crises the country has ever faced. And that was a good thing. So spin can be useful. It's not always bad. I think people should look for examples of spin that have been good for the country throughout American political history. You know, I think there's spin in the Gettysburg Address. You know, there's perhaps a bit of empirical overstatement about aspects of the situation in the Gettysburg Address. I think you can find it in a lot of speeches. I can think of Churchill's speech, "We will fight them on the beaches and so forth. Never so much been owed by so many to so few." That's hyperbolic. It's probably not true, but boy, did it hearten the British during World War II.
So good or bad, things change at a certain point. Anybody here remember a little event where burglars were caught breaking into Democratic National Headquarters back in 1972?
So yes, indeed, Watergate changed many things, and among them, the relationship between the press and politicians, because you began to have this orientation on the part of journalists to ferret out politicians' weak points of character with a determination that would be capable of bringing down a government. And this was never more true than in the 1987 presidential campaign of then Colorado Senator Gary Hart. As we heard from Sherry, he was caught having an affair with Donna Rice, and the tabloids splashed a picture of him sitting on a little boat called Monkey Business with Donna Rice, the then unknown Donna Rice, sitting on his lap. But there's a little tiny sort of historical footnote in there which may sound too technical, but it reveals something interesting about the shift in the relationship between press and politicians, and that is that in the reporting, most of the public probably remembers the Gary Hart moment, framed by Gary Hart challenging the press to follow me, and then the press following him and finding out about his affair. But in fact, what actually happened was he had given that comment in the New York Times, and the New York Times hadn't actually published it yet. And the Miami Herald had made the decision, based on a tip that they'd gotten a hold of, to stake out his condominium. And they did that before the New York Times even published Gary Hart challenging the press to follow him. The reason that's important, again, is that it shows the tectonic shift within the press, the orientation towards pursuing character, personal flaws of a politician. And as we all know, his campaign was pretty much washed up even before the National Enquirer published the picture of him sitting on Monkey Business with Donna Rice on his lap. So move forward from that as that new relationship began to evolve, and you reached yet another peak, or valley, you might say, in the 2004 campaign of Senator John Kerry, who was running for president in 2004, and he had been in Vietnam, and he had been on what we all probably know is a swift boat. And a swift boat is actually just an aluminum patrol boat that they used on the rivers of Vietnam. And he and his fellow soldiers were on these boats, and when he was running for election, the swift boat veterans came together to campaign against him and put together a campaign called the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. And as we all know, that little noun has become a verb. And here is the ad.
They had personally raped, cut off ears, cut off heads.
The accusations that John Kerry made against the veterans who served in Vietnam was just devastating.
Randomly shot at civilians.
And it hurt me more than any physical wounds I had.
Cut off limbs, blown up bodies.
That was part of the torture, was to sign a statement that you had committed war crimes.
Razed villages, fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan.
John Kerry gave the enemy for free what I and many of my comrades in North Vietnam in the prison camps took torture to avoid saying. It demoralized us.
Crimes committed on a day-to-day basis.
He betrayed us in the past. How could we be loyal to him now?
Ravaged the countryside of South Vietnam.
He dishonored his country and, more importantly, the people he served with. He just sold them out.
swift boat veterans for truth is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
So moving forward from there to yet another, probably you would have to call it valley, not a peak. You come sort of roll through a rogues gallery, which was published actually recently on the cover of the New York Times Magazine with Gary Hart prominently displayed in the middle. But we can go through names which have become familiar to many of us. Mark Sanford, Larry Craig, Anthony Weiner, John Edwards, and the list goes on. And yet another valley. We have so many valleys. Came in 2010 when you had Christine O'Donnell, who was running for senator, the great state of Delaware, and she had to counter claims that her youthful dalliance in witchcraft somehow was going to follow her through into the capital of this great nation, and she put out a campaign ad that started with that great phrase, "I am not a witch."
I'm not a witch. I'm nothing you've heard. I'm you. None of us are perfect, but none of us can be happy with what we see all around us. Politicians who think spending, trading favors, and backroom deals are the ways to stay in office. I'll go to Washington and do what you'd do. I'm Christine O'Donnell, and I approve this message. I'm you.
So ready to come back to the present day. We're going to hear about the election in a minute. But before we leave you this overview of spin, we thought we'd give you this last fictional wink at the world of political spin.
There's a crisis in the White House.
What's the crisis?
And the president's top advisors have been called together.
Oh, jeez.
The sexual misconduct occurred inside the Oval Office. With the election only days away, how much will this scandal affect the outcome?
The president spent the weekend pressing the flash. He wasn't campaigning, he was dating, actually.
Now, Washington's top spin doctor
We can distract the press for 11 days till the election. I think we got a chance.
has an idea.
We can't afford a war.
We're gonna have the appearance of a war.
But he can't pull it off without Hollywood's top producer.
Do I know you? We have some mutual friends in Washington. Why come to me? We want you to produce. You want me to produce your war? Not a war, it's a pageant. We need a theme, a song, some visuals. We need, it's a pageant.
New Line Cinema presents
How close are you to this? What do you want the kid to say?
all the spectacle,
I know we're all concerned for the president.
I know we're all concerned for the president.
I know that we are all concerned for the president.
He didn't sell the line.
all the drama,
The president's gonna go to war with Albania in about 30 minutes.
Albania's hard to run.
These are chips.
We need it for the armed position on the string. It'll be a kitten. We'll punch it in later, right?
and all the effects of real war
Okay, put the village behind her.
Give me some sound of screaming.
without the casualties.
America has seldom witnessed a more poignant picture of
They used the same process with the last Schwarzenegger movie. You're the man.
Albania, Albania.
That rhymes.
I can't believe that we forgot a hero. It was like we sent him the Christmas card and we left out the, what do you call it? Fruitcake. There you go.
Sergeant Schumann, if I may, welcome to history.
How are you?
Anybody want a beer? Because I could party.
When it's cooking, it's cooking.
From Academy Award-winning director Barry Levinson,
When this goes national, I get to put it on my resume?
Actually, no.
What could they do to me?
Take him home to your house and kill you.
Academy Award winner Dustin Hoffman,
This is politics at its finest.
Academy Award winner Robert De Niro,
How would you like an ambassadorship? That's my payoff. Hell, I just do it for a story to tell. Oh, no, you couldn't tell anybody. Listen, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, you couldn't tell me. No, it's just it's a pageant. It's a pageant, that's what it is.
Wag the Dog,
When the fit hits the shan, somebody's going to have to stay after school.
Nothing like that would ever happen in real life, right? So now we will return to the non-fictional present with a trip to Washington, where we will hear from two of our correspondents who write under the banner of the Washington Decoder. First we'll hear from Peter Greer, and then we will hear from Gail Russell Chaddock. Hi, Peter. How are you?
Hi, Gloria. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine. We don't have as nice weather as you do, but other than that, we'll survive.
Yes, we always do after elections. So we thought we would start with asking you about spin. How did you see spin play out in this election we just went through, and did you follow a couple of campaign examples you can share with us?
Well, you know, that of course depends what you mean by spin. There are lots of different levels of spin, and they're integral to every campaign. So of course it played out a lot in the midterms.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what do you really want? Do you want it to be like the Uber level, where President Obama kept insisting that the election wasn't about him, when really that's just a way of framing or trying to frame the election, and it really was about him? Or do you want like the campaign level stuff where a candidate goes, oh, you know, I didn't do X when they really did?
Mm-hmm. Well, since you just did the Uber level of President Obama, why don't we jump to a couple of the campaigns where we really saw this play out? People tried to frame an issue in a certain way, and it didn't go that way, or it went another way.
Well, let's look at, for instance, the way I personally look at spin is that it's usually the selective, it's a selective argument. You take one particular issue or one particular aspect of a particular issue that's favorable to you, and you try to emphasize that as much as you can and downplay the negative. And Mark Udall, the incumbent Democrat out there, decided he really needed to hitch his wagon to the women's vote. So he emphasized women's issues in a lot of stuff that he talked about. A lot of his ads focused on access to contraception. A lot of his interviews, he tried to steer around to particular things that he thought would be interesting to women voters. And, you know, he was doing that because he figured, well, the high Democratic vote among women, particularly single women, would counteract the fact that he would do less well among men, particularly married white men. So, you know, the problem is that didn't work out for him. He did do pretty well among women, but the women didn't turn out to vote like he needed to win. So turnout was down among women. It was down like 9%, I believe, from the presidential vote in 20. Even though the spin kind of worked in that he motivated the voters he wanted to motivate, he lost anyway. So in that sense, you know, spin is kind of, it can be not irrelevant, but it's only one part of the equation. And in many ways, especially in midterms, getting your voters out and shaping the actual electorate that goes to the polls is more important than whether you're a good spin meister.
Can you talk a little bit about how spin plays into reaching that demographic that typically turns out for a presidential election, but seems to be much harder to reach in the midterms?
Sure, but again, you know, I'm talking about a pretty broad definition of spin here. I'm really just talking about selective campaigning and selective use of issues. And, you know, I don't know if that's a little different than what you're getting at, which is, you know, one guy going on TV, say, and putting out some sort of outrageous charge about an opponent. But in any case, so like with the selective use of issues, again, it's really fascinating how different the midterm electorate is from the presidential election electorates. They're really completely different groups made up of completely different subgroups. And so Democrats want to motivate young people. They want to motivate women to get out to vote. They want to motivate minorities because that's really, they get a much higher percentage of that vote, and that's what's good for them. The Republicans want to motivate white voters, particularly white males. So you get them basically talking about two completely different sets of issues. And for instance, this time, the Democrats were not all that successful. Women, and in particular, and minorities stayed home in droves. So in many states, you had female and minority turnout like down 9%, say down 7%. That makes a big difference in the final outcome. And that's why you saw, as the vote approached, some Democratic candidates would resort to fairly drastic measures to try and motivate those voters. In Louisiana, Senator Mary Landrieu talked about, well, yeah, you know, my state kind of has a bad racial history, and that's part of the reason that President Obama is not that popular here. So, you know, a lot of people thought, oh, that's a gaffe. She insulted white people. But, you know, those white people, generally speaking, were not going to vote for her anyway. She really needed to get more minorities to the polls if she was going to have any chance of winning. And I think that by resorting to that particular formulation and giving that answer, what she was trying to do was go, hey, you know, my voters really need to get to the polls or I'm going to lose. And, of course, we don't actually know yet whether she's going to lose because she's going into a runoff. But she did not get 50% of the vote. She looks like it's quite probable that she's headed for defeat in the runoff, and so she was pushing all the buttons at that point, and that's really what spin is, after all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's talk about another of the individual campaigns. Get away from that, the broader electorate question. Do you have any other good examples of a campaign that really is sort of spun off a lot of spin and perhaps was successful for the spinner?
Well, again, in other words, you know, people that produce lots of flyers that were perhaps misleading or something like that, or ads that were particularly flamboyant. I mean, you know, because spin, after all, is in the eye of the beholder.
Mm-hmm. Well, you had the hog castrator in Iowa, and she won.
You do. You do have Joni Ernst. She won. That ad, of course, talked about her background castrating hogs. But, you know, is that spin really to have that ad to go, well, you know, I was a farmer and my opponent was not a farmer, which that emphasizes. Her opponent, in fact, was a lawyer who had spoken down to farmers, or at least spoken badly of farmers at a particular event. And, you know, Ernst made sure that most of the voters of Iowa knew about that. So, you know, is that spin taking a particular thing that your opponent said perhaps in the heat of the moment and making sure everybody sees it? I mean, it probably is by lots of definitions, but, you know, if spin implies something that's really unfair, I don't think that was unfair. You know, he really did say that, and you've got to watch your words when you're running for national office.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of deconstruction lessons do you think people can take away from this election cycle? How can they? What kind of deconstruction lessons can we take out of this?
Well, I mean, in other words, how can you say cut through spin and understand what's really going on?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, first of all, spin is just really another word for politics. And the one thing I always say is that there's no news source that knows everything. And it behooves all voters to learn as much as they can and to think critically about what they learn, and especially the facts and figures, because there's no substitute for making up your own mind.
Mm-hmm. And what about just good old influence of money in a campaign to get one message out over another?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Money really only matters if there's an imbalance. The absolute levels of it don't matter that much. There's a lot of political science about this. And it's difficult to buy an election unless your opponent isn't really even trying. So money matters if your opponent doesn't spend nearly as much as you. Money matters more if you're a challenger than if you're an incumbent, because you have more to teach the voters about yourself. And money matters more the lower the race you go, because people don't pay that much attention and they can learn more about you or your opponent through advertising and the other stuff that money buys. You know, in a Senate race, and particularly in a presidential race, I really think that money is just the equivalent of the superpower nuclear arms race. You know, they build and build and build and never get anywhere.
So any final thought about spin?
Final thought about spin. You know, I read a very interesting piece the other day asking, is spin dead?
and that's referring to really the lowest level of spin. That's referring to James Carville going on TV and giving you his particular take on events in a particular manner that leaves out lots of stuff that's bad for him, or vice versa with Karl Rove. And the reason for that is spin dead because it's gotten so obvious and so baroque. If you watch cable, political shows on cable news, it's like it's a reality show in which they always end up shouting at each other. And they're not really trying to convince you anymore. They're just trying to put on a show for the benefit of the political, the political industrial entertainment complex, which is based in Washington, D.C., and makes lots and lots of money, which is how all those people can afford such nice cars.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Really appreciate your comments.
Anytime.
Gail, how are you?
Hey, Gloria. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
So let's talk about the election cycle we just went through. How did you see spin play out, either in individual campaigns or in kind of the larger political climate we just went through?
Well, I've seen a number of campaign cycles, but what struck me about this one was how sophisticated the voters had become. I mean, there was a time when terms like war room and spin were relatively unknown. And then we saw, of course, the famous War Room movie about the Clinton administration, this idea that the staff can quickly respond to everything and it doesn't even go through the candidate. It's just spin. It's just, you send a tennis ball flying across the net at me, I send it back flying across at you, and somehow the insiders knew that the tennis ball really didn't have much to do with anything. It was just a play to manipulate fear or anxiety, or anger, which are the three strongest emotions. And that spin is really about emotion. It's about getting people to focus on something in a way that you want them to. But what was striking about this election is how ubiquitous it had become, and I think how sophisticated the public had become about it. Another place you see that a lot in this campaign is in the gun ads. I haven't even seen a final tally of how much was spent, but the NRA made this a very important year of spending and spent millions on ads in key states that had referendum. Could there be background checks, for example? But for the first time, there was a considerable amount of money available to counter that spin. Michael Bloomberg committed $50 million running up against the NRA this cycle. Gabby Gifford, the congresswoman from Arizona, who was grievously wounded in a mass shooting and came back to really make her life work focused on this issue, also has collected millions of dollars that were devoted to this campaign. As a result, you have dueling ads that are both excellent examples of spin. In the ad for the NRA, you usually saw a scene like a woman alone at night. Cue the dark music, silence. Suddenly, the door opens, a window goes up, the steps are heard. You have no protection, and then there's a scene later with police there, but it kind of looks like a crime scene, and a body bag is about to come out of the house. It's just emotion. And the response from the pro-gun control people also has this sort of dark music in the background as it intones that candidate X or Y somehow doesn't favor a background check that would be useful. It doesn't come right out and say what the consequence will be. It doesn't show you a mass shooting, for example. But you don't need to do that. There's been a number of them, and people know what that means.
And were they defeated? Which way did these referenda go?
Actually, the referendum went strongly in favor of gun control. For the most part, the referendum in this whole election went against the Republican wave. Positions that the Republican Party supported on some of these referenda on issues like marijuana and guns were voted differently. That's another interesting example of the history of spin. I guess when people live closely to something and have strong views on it, they're not so readily drawn into someone else's effort to shape their emotions and how they think about it.
Yes, I think that you're hitting on the idea that voters are far more sophisticated about spin now is a good way to finish up. Why do you think they've become more sophisticated, and what do you think people watching this tonight can take away about spin?
Well, one thing, there was one very interesting press event that Senator Goodale gave, and he started segueing into some of his lines about women's rights, reproductive rights, how you should be afraid, very afraid. And some of the audience yelled out, that is not the only issue in this campaign. What are you doing? You're more than that. You have other issues. And that kind of protest became in itself a teachable moment. And you see more sophistication just in how the ads are discussed and analyzed. Mm-hmm. And there is so much money in politics now, thanks to campaign reform, which is campaign finance reform, which has gone exactly the opposite of the way it was intended. Reforms that started out to limit the amount of money in politics have over time morphed into vastly increasing the amount of money in politics and lowering what we know about it, who funds it. As a result, there is a great deal of money out there to try to influence people. Well, sometimes you can't spend enough of it. How do you possibly spend the amount of money? This election was more than $4 billion. How do you possibly spend that much money? Answer, on television with ads. Sort of blanket images on cell phones, on computer, on television. As a result,
that's visual spin, yeah.
That's where the fatigue comes in. If you see one or two, that's one thing. But you're talking about 80,000 some areas the last week. I mean, it's just too much. You can't help but get fatigued by it, and the combination of seeing it too many times and hearing the kind of discussion that you are having, with your group tonight. People are interested in not being manipulated. They want to think. And once you're aware of, that shark music from Jaws intends to do, it doesn't scare you anymore. It just kind of becomes ludicrous and funny. And that's what, I have to say, Senator Goodale is a very effective and good senator. But whoever he paid to manage his campaign did him no good turn on this.
Okay, Gail, I wanted to go back to the RAE thing that you talked about before.
Yes.
The Rising American Electorate.
Yes.
Do you want to define that?
I was looking at something this morning by a Get Out the Vote group in Georgia that had defined a whole new category on their website. You see a picture of a lot of black women raising their arms joyfully and happily. And in the middle of this picture are two white people who are organizing this voting drive. And in it, they specify that the rising American electorate are African American voters, young people under the age of 25 to 27, that early millennial category, and single women. And that the whole purpose of the registration drive was to pull together the rising American electorate. Now, it's one thing to say we're interested in registering young voters. We're interested in registering new Americans. We're interested in registering African Americans. But when you define the electorate exactly like a Democratic focus group, here are the strongest elements that vote for us. Therefore, let's just get a label for it and say that there's some civic purpose in encouraging this group to register, but none other. That's another very interesting change from the registration when I was involved in campaigns in the 60s and early 70s. I mean, in those days, registering meant you just went out into a neighborhood and basically registered anything that breathed. Now that's not how it works. because someone figured out that registering someone that's not going to vote for you undermines the good work you did by registering someone who will. Therefore, target who you're going to register. Why help your opponent? That's the kind of thinking that only makes sense in a country that's become so polarized that it's now inconceivable to think that you could rationally talk someone on the other side of your partisan team onto your side. But that, when I saw that, I thought, we really are to the point where the political class has become so emboldened in how they carve up these campaigns that they're letting their spin strategy hang right out there in the open, thinking that no one will notice or mind.
But of course, this educated group will notice and they will mind because of you.
Well, I have to say that one was a new one on me just earlier today. So once you start looking for it, you'll see it all over the place. The essence of spin is repetition. And if you want to take a really deep look at it, what Hitler said was that if you're going to tell a lie, just make sure you tell a big one. Because it's a big lie, repeated, that will be believed, even more readily than a small lie. And so a lot of the big spin ads we saw this cycle were simply lie. Cory Gardner, the Republican opponent who ended up winning the race, wasn't opposed to contraception. He was opposed to government funding of it, and for that to be mandatory, but that's quite a different thought than to suggest that you could wake up one morning and find that there isn't a condom to be found west of the Mississippi, which is pretty much what those ads suggested. So what I'm excited about with the internet, with all the social networking and so forth, there is still a possibility of educating people to be wiser about that. And once they are, instead of making them afraid, as whoever Senator Udall's team thought they were doing, you make them laugh. And once people start laughing, they have to turn to something else, and maybe it will be telling the truth.
For all the years we've gone through talking about spin, complaining about spin, it seems to have exhausted itself. We may be in a time of spin fatigue. And it's as you say, it's an interesting subject to be taking up and to wonder, well, what comes next?
Mm-hmm. Do you really think it's possible for politicians to not spin? Will they simply come up with a new, more subtle, more sophisticated way of spinning, and we should tighten up our spin sniffers even more aggressively?
Well, if you use a term like propaganda or marketing, propaganda was a term that first appeared in the Reformation. The papacy was concerned about what was happening with this new thinking about religion sweeping Europe, and they set up an organization simply to deal with changing people's thought. It was picked up, there's a very famous book on propaganda, I think you referred to it in some of your material, by Bernays on propaganda. And Hitler actually read a lot of this material, and his concept of changing people's thoughts by taking a big idea, a lie preferably, and a big lie at that, and simply repeating it. That if you repeat something long enough and loud enough, eventually it will sink in. And I think that's that notion of spin, that you have to say it hard, you have to say it fast, you have to immediately reverse what someone says, you have to invoke fear, anxiety, and anger, because those are what motivate people. But when you look down the list of the winners in this election, they had a different style. Some of the most notable, we've talked about the Cory Gardner being Exhibit A. He just came across as someone who listened to others, had a sense of humor about how quick his party was to dismiss other thought. And, it may be setting up a new model for how candidates see. It's been so etched in the deep political operatives that they have to make people afraid or it won't work for such a long time that it may be hard to get off it. But when you have the kind of outcome you did in this election, where some of the best professional thinking about how to spin subjects for people who are supposed to win their elections fairly easily, I think it's at moments like that that sometimes people rethink where they are on these issues.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great. Thanks very much, Gail. Really appreciate you taking the time out of a very busy post-election writing to talk to us.
Good to hear your voices.
Okay. Okay, so that was a bit of bum sitting to listen to that. So we are now going to turn the corner to our workshop. It is time for the workshop, so everybody stand up. Jake, you ready? Jake, you ready? Yeah. Okay, so now we're ready to turn your spin sniffers on. And the first thing that's going to happen is you are going to receive a handout that's going to help you tune up your spin sniffer. So let's get those down the aisles. All right, does everybody have a piece of paper in their hand now? Pretty much? All right, so Dan is going to walk you through all these pointers, and then we are going to hear an admonition from our professor.
We're going to see a clip, and we want you to look for these techniques of spin in this clip, and I'm going to read them. Cherry picking, selectively presenting facts, quotes, and polls that supports one's position. The non-apology apology, it's where you admit mistakes were made, which diffuses attacks without taking any responsibility. Avoiding the question or answering a variation of the question asked. Releasing bad news when the media is focused on really bad news. There's a well-known case where the British firm on 9/11 told all its overseas affiliates, now is the time to get this out. Releasing good news at the same time as several unpopular things, hoping that the media will focus on the popular one. Misdirection and diversion. Change the subject to a gray area, factor of opinion that's in dispute rather than clear. It can't be easily discredited. Selected leaks. That's where chosen journalists are given information exclusively to secure a positive slant. Unattributable background briefings used to fabricate allegations or smear people. Exclusive stories released as part of official leaks to set the agenda.
Okay, so first we're going to hear an admonition, right?
All right, sure.
Yeah. Okay, first we are going to hear an admonition from our professor.
Well, I think spin sniffing first has to pay attention to the orientation of the person who's receiving the spin. Is that person sympathetic with the spinner? If so, you are more likely to accept what the spinner says without really subjecting it to critical scrutiny to determine if it's true or false. So I think that's the first question anybody has to ask themselves when confronting spin. When spin is from a hostile source, your critical faculties go into high gear. But when it's something sympathetic, you're more likely to accept something, a statement that is not true or is not a real statement of responsibility, because the person who said it is someone you're inclined to agree with. So I think that's the first thing the workshop has to address. The first question anyone has to address when receiving spin. Am I willing to swallow this because I'm inclined to agree with it?
Okay, so next we are going to hear a clip that you are going to turn your newly tuned up critical faculties upon and sniff your way through and see what you come up with.
Why is Bill Clinton campaigning in competitive Senate races and the president not?
The president is campaigning in competitive races.
No, in competitive Senate races. Why is President Clinton is, President Obama isn't? Why?
The president is campaigning in competitive races during this election cycle, and we have one of the most well-positioned situations for a second-term midterm of any majority party in probably a generation. I mean, normally the president's party in a second-term midterm loses an average of 29 seats, and I mean, at worst, we're going to be in single digits, and I think we could even be in single digits and pick up a few seats
in the House.
And I think we hold the Senate.
But just out of curiosity, what competitive Senate races is the president campaigning in?
Like I said, the president has been campaigning in competitive races.
But what competitive Senate race is the president campaigning in? Is there one?
There are races that the president is campaigning in around the country, and he's also governing. He's doing his job, and he's also spent time recording robocalls and doing radio spots and making sure that our GOTV focus is as aggressive as possible. So we're deploying the president where he can be the most helpful, and he's both doing GOTV rallies and GOTV messaging, and it's been a welcome addition, and we very much appreciate it. I know our candidates appreciate it.
Okay, so now for those of you who were here last time, you'll know the drill, and for those of you who are new to tonight, what we're going to do is form pods, and roughly 6 to 8 people kind of just turn around and group with your neighbors, and there's going to be people who will kind of handhold you through these things. And what we're going to do for the next 10 minutes is you guys are going to share your sniffs. Share what you have detected in this clip, and then when you are done with that, after about 10 minutes, we're going to come together and share them with everybody, okay? So form your little groups, be friendly, be nice to each other, yeah, roughly, and go. Okay, pencils down, boys and girls. Okay, all right, we have a Phil Donahue up here who's going to come down to the audience with his mic, and spokesperson for each group is going to relay all of your fabulous insights.
Do we have the people already volunteered? Do I volunteer for them?
Just go up one line and down the other.
Who's with you guys' group? What did your group decide that they saw in their clip?
We came up with several, and like at the top of the cherry picking, selectively putting out the facts was one of the things that we clearly heard. Avoiding the question, obviously, was in there, and trying to release some good news, or at least put out what they assumed were positive remarks about the president, what he was doing, and then keep on misdirecting or directing the conversation someplace else. So those are the things we've heard.
All right, ditto to what was just said.
Ditto. How about you guys?
Also ditto, but with the cherry picking, we were sort of saying, you know, it's not just the woman who's being interviewed who was cherry picking facts, but also the interviewees, you know, are selecting very specific things to ask about and focus on.
That would be making the media the bad guy. Get out.
A British friend here said that she was thrown to the wolves. Because when you look at what it said at the bottom, where's POTUS in the midterms? So that's clearly what the media wanted to talk about. And we also felt that she was not well briefed by her party, because she's a DNC chair in Florida, right? And so she was sticking to her talking points of avoiding the question. And she was trying to change the subject to kind of the gray area. Oh, he is campaigning, he's out there, but she didn't have any specific facts.
What about you, British guy?
We took the time to elect a pod leader, so we didn't really have to go beyond that.
My partners thought we saw evidence in the third one down, avoiding the question, because that's been cited before, answering a variation of the question, when she couldn't really pinpoint which senator was being supported. And then I suppose the point she was making about we've lost fewer seats than we normally do, you know, that was, you could say that was a cherry pick or misdirection and variation. You want to take your pick about that cherry pick. So anyway, those are the two things.
Definitely. We all agreed that it was avoiding the question many times. She did very well at that. And then we felt very much misdirection, diversion was her other tactic. But one of our members said that she really tried to create a new reality
in a very short period of time, but we all felt it was unsuccessful.
Change the subject to a gray area, Dan's hair. So, my friend John over here, where we were talking about what is GOTV? Does anybody know?
Get out and vote.
Okay, well, John has a different idea. John, what do you say GOTV really is? Where was the president campaigning this year?
He was campaigning in Pakistan.
There you go, Pakistani television, GOTV. We found that out. And it's a great time over there. They're all wishing him the best. They're going to get out to vote, I think, the Pakistanis.
My final comment is, at least I have hair.
A little stand-up comedy never hurts. Well, our group concurred with several of the other groups. We felt that the first obvious one was avoiding the question. The second one was misdirection and diversion. And the third one was cherry picking. But as some of the other groups said, it did seem that they were forced in their topic, that the media were sort of pre-focused on the topic of that question, and that she was not very well prepared. She just didn't make for great television or great anything. So we would rate them very highly on the whole thing. But it was an interesting discussion about some people in the group who are focused on using traditional media and some don't. So it was very educational on many fronts. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the official end of your spin sipping exercise. And you may take this home with you and keep it by your TV, your radio, your cell phone, your Facebook, your Twitter feed, all the places that you get information, and you can sniff out that spin. So thank you for coming. That is.
Thank you, Dan and Glo. And thank you all for coming tonight. We look forward to welcoming you to our next event on How Sports Drives the News. It'll take place on Thursday, February 12th, 2015, right here at 7:30 p.m. It's also a Thursday night. Before you go home tonight, though, be sure to take some time to see the photo exhibit in the reading room entitled Through the Lens of the Christian Science Monitor, Then and Now. It illustrates some of the progress seen through the decades by pairing beautiful black and white photographs taken by the then chief photographer, Gordon Converse, with recent covers from the Christian Science Monitor Weekly. If you haven't already, you can see the exhibit right next door where you registered for tonight. In addition to the exhibit, you can chat with Dan and Glo. They'll both be over there and ready to have some good conversations, and other workshop attendees over some tasty morsels. So thank you again for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in February.